Hello, welcome to a recording about the Aqua Tower project. This is going to just be a cursory overview of both the base parameters and then the overall shape of this definition. During the class, I'm going to talk about shapes of definitions and how to kind of read them a little bit, especially when you're starting out. But the big thing to know is that your stuff on the left flows into your stuff on the right. So these are going to be the things that create. These are things that you're going to be modifying, generally speaking, that then modify or create things on the right side. I have been playing with this definition a little bit. I'm kind of showing you it in media res here. This entire area down here is actually disabled right now. That's to help my computer run a little bit faster during this. But I do want you guys to kind of get into the habit of grouping things into like sensible groups. These each do their own individual thing, but if you see a little blobby or circular one, I'm generally going to start using that as my way of saying these are things you can edit and these are parameters, while the square ones are things that are being made somewhat or determined by something else down the line on the left. You can still plug those into other things, like you're seeing from this top box into this right box, or this box into both of these. But generally, this is the stuff we edit. This is the stuff we get out. First, we're going to talk about the actual shapes that we're using. So I'm going to primarily focus on just some surfaces for this exercise. You'll notice down here in the Rhino window that I've got 3 different curves and I've got a line going up them. The line is actually not part of this. It was just there to set a distance. But if I zoom in here and select this loft, this is the overall command I'm using to generate this, we have this larger shape. This shape is just kind of random. Don't worry about it. There's no meaning ascribed to it, but it's generated from these 3 curves. So I'm going to pull a panel down here, this big yellow thing, to just show you what the information inside looks like. So if I just plug that in, you'll see that this is saying it's a referenced periodic planar curve. That's totally fine. It's just the way that Grasshopper is reading these, and that there's 3 of them. This plugs into this rebuild curve component. This essentially just makes them a little bit more consistent. It gives them the same amount of control points so that when we loft them, it is more consistent. It can control things like how tight the curve is, but it just makes a better piece of data. I sketched these original curves very quickly. They're not super consistent. Some of them have like 15 control points. Some of them have like 20. Some of them have 4. Well, not that few, but you get the idea. This one will make that all the same. What comes out of it is going to essentially be the same thing. You'll notice it doesn't say referenced anymore. It's now saying that it's building it here. That's not really important, but the thing to pay attention is that these are planar. Loft does not require planar curves. It usually runs that way. You're going to be able to think of it better that way because they're basically section curves. Like whatever curve you put there will be a section at that point. But when we get to something like capping the holes here in order to make something a solid, that becomes more important because it will have to be planar in order for that to work. This stuff down here, these are called loft options. So remember that you can just hover over your individual letters for your inputs and your outputs, and it will tell you what these are. So if you're wondering what plugs in somewhere, you might be able to find it just by hovering over it. In this case, I have loft options. This basically will allow you to do some of the options that if you were using loft in Rhino that you can do here. So you can close your loft if you want to. You can adjust the seams, which is primarily why I'm using it. You can rebuild things, which actually can do some of what I'm doing up here. Refitting them, which is going to be whether or not it's going to be closely fit to the curves essentially. And then whether or not you're using like a loose or a tight or a straight loft. Once again, if you don't have a preference on these, don't worry about it. Like, they can just be there as normal. They'll just be on the defaults generally. You'll notice the one thing I am changing here is this adjust seams. I am going to go ahead and turn off this toggle. So Boolean toggles just switch between true and false. They are found in your input parameters. They're this button up here. If I just double click on that, it will go to false. You'll notice that now my shape is kind of like inflecting between these. This has to do with how I originally drew these curves. One was actually just, I drew it counterclockwise, while the other ones I drew clockwise. And so it doesn't understand where the start and the end is really supposed to be in relation to them. The adjust tool here just adjusts it and makes them more consistent. This will not always fix things, but it's a pretty, if this is starting to like look a little real weird, try your loft option. If you build your surface another way, or if you don't build your surface in Grasshopper, that's fine. I've got a surface here. This one I created from lofting inside of Rhino, and then I just reference it and internalize it in Grasshopper. That's fine. When I say internalize, what I'm saying is that there's like some piece of data in the parameter that's always there. So right now these are referenced. But if I right click on this, I can come down to internalize data. You'll notice that the referenced went away. Now, if I change these things in Rhino, they're not going to change anymore. They're simply part of this component. It's just like if you had manually typed in numbers. They exist within Grasshopper. This is really helpful whenever you're sending somebody data. If you just want to send a Grasshopper script, you can just internalize your stuff, and then you don't have to like link it to a 3DM file and hope it's linking to the right things. So keep that in mind when you're asking questions if you're on the forum or something like that. I'm going to just back out of that because I don't really have a reason to do that right now. I'm just going to keep it off or keep them referenced. Finally, there's this cap hole tool. All this does is it creates a cap on the top, and in this case at the bottom, of the shape that we've got. This only works for planar surfaces. It will not work if you've got something curvy. The tool for that is generally patch, and you have to select data manually, and at that point you're better off just referencing the surface after you fix it from Rhino, instead of trying to like build it in Grasshopper a lot of the time, or find a way to rebuild it in Grasshopper. So anyway, you'll notice that there's a pinch point here. This is going to be where if you have in my case, I'm looking for a capped brep, and then I also have another closed brep here. Both of them are closed. You can basically interchange them. So I'm actually going to just plug this into the back end here. First, I'll show you what the shape of this generally looks like. So that relates to the shape very closely, right? If I just plug this one into the back of this, it'll override it. Hopefully it doesn't break. Yeah. Now it references the shape. So keep an eye on where your pinch points and stuff are in your script. That's going to be places where you can try to experiment and play with things. It's also where if you need to take part of this script and cut and paste it somewhere else, you can usually find an area where there's only one wire and plug it in a different way. So the other types of parameters that we're using are going to be not referenced. They are going to be parts of the actual setup inside of Grasshopper. In this case, I'm using number sliders. So this number slider here, this group, is referencing height for the floors in this, basically in cutting the overall shape. And this one is going to be the number of those floors that I'm using. generally speaking, you're going to be using lots of things to orient stuff in Grasshopper, like these vectors and these planes. We'll talk about them a little bit more whenever we get to fixing a problem with this, which will be in a different video. But if we look at these heights here, if I increase, and what I will do actually is increase the size of that for you. So if we start increasing and decreasing this height, you'll notice that it gets chunkier. Should also note that this is giving us an error down the way. We now have more things than we need, so it doesn't know how to handle that extra data. But this is a way to start selecting like where the cut starts making sense. Or if you like your floor height's changed from 12 to 14 feet because you have to put in a mechanical system, that happens pretty quickly. You'll notice that if I go too small, I don't fill the whole thing. So this number down here is our floor count. I am arraying a section cut. So essentially contours. Oop, there we go. Contours by a certain number here. If I don't have enough, it will stop because there's not enough there. This component here would be better set as a relationship instead of a basic parameter. So if I knew I always wanted this height of, or this shape overall, which essentially would be height as well. If this component here was more of a function that said I have this height that I'm pulling from the object, and then I have this floor height, can I divide them and get a whole number, or maybe one extra from that number just in case we have a rounding error or something? Can I get that in order to create a consistent shape but be able to change this floor height a little bit more dynamically? So we'll do that in another video, but that would be a better way to build this part of this function. Just really quickly, this is over here really simple things. I'm basically just extruding these components, but I am comparing what is essentially this shape with this shape. And this is the geometry where I start looking at where these cuts are, these lines, and then I'm trimming them in order to get different parts of them, and then I'm adding them together, and then I'm extruding them. Once again, there's actually another thing here. I've included this in this component, so there's another parameter that changes things, but because this is all related to my balconies, I've kept it together here. It made more sense. These make sense for the whole project. Some of these smaller things make sense for these particular components. When you start building your own components and getting your own methodology, you may want to locate all your parameters in one area. I generally take pieces of these things and I put them into the other scripts, so I try to build my scripts where if it's all together in one thing, it's just generally one thing. So the other thing I want to note is that all this stuff down here, you'll see all these red lines. These are turned off. We can turn them on, but it's not really important. So they're essentially doing similar functions with either different shapes or comparing different types of geometry. Like I'm rotating like a more curvy thing to intersect with the first curvy thing. But if you ever want to like turn off something because your computer is lagging or you're messing with something downstream and it's taking too long up here, you can simply, and we'll start over here on the loft tool. If you hold middle click, you'll get this wheel. You have several options here. This turns things on, this turns things off. This shows things, this hides things, but they still process. I will also refer to this as bird boxing occasionally. This groups things, so this is how I'm getting that kind of violet-y thing around it. You can change the color and actually label those groups too. This will create a little container box. We'll get into that later in the semester. This one will lock your solver, so it prevents it from solving anything, which can be really useful because if you're still manipulating things, maybe you want to finish manipulating them and then have it go. If you're locked and you do want it to go, but just the one time, you can hit the play button. The egg here is for baking. And then there's a handful of other settings and zoom tools, but those are generally the ones I use the most. But if you see one of these grayed out like this, like the icon loses its color, that's because it's been disabled. So that's a really quick overview of the different components and how I've set up some parameters here. Next video, we'll go about creating a definition here that starts to fix some of the problems I was mentioning in this video. Thanks, and see you next time.